Good evening. My name is Chido Chashe, and today we are back again with another episode of the podcast, The Africa We Want, where we discuss issues that are inherently important for the continent, particularly trying to come up with ideas on how best we can progress as a continent to ensure that we achieve sustainable development, which basically is all inclusive. So today we're going to be talking about intellectual property rights within the context of Africa. It's going to be a very interesting discussion because we have Tin, who's going to introduce herself, and we also have Becky, and they are pretty much going to be touching on different aspects of IP right protection in Africa. So maybe before I get into the discussion, Christine, Becky, you might want to introduce yourselves to the listeners.
Hi everyone, my name is Christine and I'm glad to be part of this podcast again, and I look forward to having this discussion on IP and the IP market in Africa as Judas introduced it. Thank you.
And I'm Becky. I'm happy to be here today, and I'm also looking forward to this discussion. I'll be mostly looking at the effect of intellectual property rights on innovation precisely in the African continent.
Thank you so much. Maybe to just highlight what we're really talking about for the benefit of somebody who is not an IP guru. So intellectual property rights basically are those rights that are given to persons over the creations of their minds. So the word intellectual in a way really speaks to the fact that these are rights that accrue as a result of creations of the mind. So usually the creator of that content is given an exclusive right over the use of their creation for a certain period of time. So for instance, we can talk about literary work that really falls under copyright and all the other rights that are related to copyright. We can talk about all these IP rights that relate to industrial property, where we're talking about patents. We're talking about industrial designs, geographical indications, and all those other things. So maybe if I could give it to Christine to tell us about the IP market within the continent.
Okay, thanks Chido. And as regards the IP market in Africa, the starting point really is, what would a functional IP market need? In short, what would attract someone to invest in the intellectual property market within Africa? And this means that what would make someone want to come and create value using their intellectual capabilities, their creativity, their knowledge within Africa and commercialize it? And the first thing to look at is protection of IP, because protection of IP results into protection of the investment, which now attracts investment. Because the whole point with investing is that you want your right to that property to be protected. And the starting point really is that for an investor to come into the market, they need at least for their rights to be guaranteed and to be protected. And to be protected from what? It's to be protected from being someone taking the rights and imitating whatever property has been created, coming up with an imitation and passing it off. And therefore, the person has spent so much money investing into it, and they have spent so much of their time into it, but then they end up not recouping their investment. So, and the other thing about intellectual property is that it's how it's at the end of the day, how you get results from it is by using what you create and being able to license it, for instance. So for a functional market within Africa, there needs to be protection of IP. And then the next thing is that research and development costs, which are what someone would incur investing in that sector, are quite significant. And think about it this way: before you recoup your investment within investing into IP, it takes quite a bit of time, because you have to research on it, you have to take your ideas, you have to develop them to come up with something that can be used in the market. So let's say, for instance, I have the idea to create a certain kind of car that performs certain functions. So I need to, first of all, do the research, design it, have a prototype. That takes money, takes time to develop the prototypes, and to come up with something that works. So the cost of investment are quite significant. And so recouping them and the guarantee that you can recoup those costs through selling into the market is a big thing for the market to function within Africa. And then the other thing that an investor, like especially foreign direct investment into Africa, into IP, is that there needs to be a way to have the investor, especially if someone is coming from outside Africa, that their rights will be protected and that they will be able to recoup. The difference between what I was speaking about a minute ago is that for foreigners, there's a lot of risk. And the level of protection that they'll be seeking, especially within Africa, might be different and is likely to be different. Why would I say this? For instance, like if you are a foreigner, there are things that you may not be entitled to under the Constitution. Yes, the Constitution may give the right to property, the right to different things. But then when you're coming as a foreigner, you ask, for instance, I'm coming from outside, can I be able to enforce this within this market? Or what do I need under my contract so that I can be able to enforce it? What if also this court, so they entertain my claim, especially if I'm, let's say, a company that's operating from outside Africa and I have a claim in Africa, what are the chances of my succeeding? How will the society perceive me? There's a lot for a foreigner who wants to invest in this sector within Africa that they have to consider. So even to attract those kinds of people to invest within Africa IP, there needs to be more guaranteed of protection, that the government will not take your investment from you because of the government has tried to kick out all foreigners from the country. So the risk of a foreign investor might be higher. Even if domestic investors as well need that kind of protection, for foreigners, the risk that they have is higher. And then also the other thing I would say, like for a functional IP market and to succeed within the market, is to give tax incentives. And why tax incentives in particular is that, first of all, it's the cost that go into it. So I want to know that the government is encouraging me and telling me, let's say, for instance, for the period that which you'll be purely bleeding out in terms of the money that you're spending. You're just spending and spending and spending. That I can have an incentive where, like, some of these costs, maybe I can capitalize them and in future claim them as a deduction, or these costs I can deduct them and therefore for the period that I'm not making any money, there'll be losses to me, but I can carry them forward to offset when I start making money in the future. Or the other alternative is, even when I'm making money, then give me an incentive that I can claim a higher deduction of my research and development costs. So those are the things that I would look at, Chido, in terms of like what would a functional IP market need within Africa. Those are thoughts that I have to begin with. But then, Becky, you could add more onto what I've said as far as this goes.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because there's a sort of balancing act that is required for you to have a thriving IP market, like the ability to attract foreign investors who will bring their inventions with them and also promote domestic inventors. But so let me start with something a little bit ideological here and then get down to where we are practically in terms of how Africa as a continent is performing in terms of intellectual property. And I think I will be leaning more towards patents because I am more in the tech industry. So intellectual property rights, protecting new knowledge, and evidently contribution of new knowledge to the rest of the world from sub-Saharan Africa is somehow very minimal. Now, this is not a reflection of our intellectual capacity or lack thereof. Rather, this is something around the theory of geographic determinism, which has been very well outlined by the geographer Jared Diamond, where the world is right now is more of a reflection of how societies evolved, being more like very heavily influenced by their immediate environment than from any other factor. And it's quite something fascinating to follow the thread of how human civilization has evolved over the last 5 centuries and see how different things played out. Now, what does this have to do with patents? A whole lot, because the reality is that we are many decades, and by we I mean Africa as a continent is many decades behind developed countries technologically. From a little exposure on IPRs, it's And I understand that some of them are embedded in the World Trade Organization, has some agreements with several countries on the common minimum standards. And I should disclose here that I owe much of my little knowledge to a very informative paper that was published in the Journal of World Intellectual Property last year in November by Graf and Paddy. I found myself, as I was trying to inform myself about IPRs in Africa, I found myself inclining more towards a minimalist viewpoint in which there is a strong case against a strong patent regime, like a very, as Christina said, it's very necessary to provide incentives and attract foreigners to come to bring their innovations here and ensure that they are protected, they will get their return on investment. But there are several ways in which a very strong patent regime can be disadvantageous to developing countries, and the argument is threefold. The first is that a strong patent regime can be counterproductive to development. And in this sense, Africa is mostly an inheritor of foreign technologies because of what I've just described. We are lagging behind other continents. So if, say, a certain part of the technology, I'll just use Facebook and Uber as an example, as a loose example. If a certain part of the technology that makes Facebook work is patented, and Facebook patents it in the US and across the world, that means that Facebook gets to derive all the benefits from their technology overseas. And this is seen as a transfer of wealth from domestic markets to developed countries. And I think that has already become apparent. I remember the last time we were talking about the frustration of certain countries on how to cash in, at least in form of taxes, on part of the income that multinational corporations are deriving from developing countries. So the first argument is that if it's tight, the better protected the multinationals are, all the income goes with them. The second argument is tied to the first one also, that when large corporations who have first mover advantage patent something, it makes it very difficult for domestic inventors to compete. So, because if you ask yourself, does it mean that there haven't been African startups who have, social networking or taxi hailing inventions? But when there is a strong patent regime that zealously protects global tech giants, local inventors literally stand no chance to get anything off the ground. On the other hand, a weaker patent regime allows local inventors to, and I know Christine mentioned this as one of the things that needs not to exist in a functional IP market, but when you have a loose patent regime, it allows inventors to imitate technologies from wealthier countries so that they can be able to produce local solutions at a faster rate and at a lower cost. And an antagonist will ask, so should we just allow piracy and imitations? And the answer is that it really wouldn't be the first time that is happening. And the results are actually remarkably good. Going back in history, Germany and the US did just that. That's how they caught up with British and French systems in the 19th century. After that, Japan and Korea did the same thing to catch up with the West. And the example that we can all relate right now is China. So I know we can laugh all we want about knockoffs from China, but it is exactly that freedom to take apart, say, a Nokia phone and imitate it to near perfection and sell it as Nokia, that amount of loose sort of regime that allows you to do that is what has allowed China to build a skill set that is now trusted by the world's biggest brands for manufacturing and assembling. If they didn't have that skill set in manufacturing and assembling, no one would be taking their business there. And that's why there are factories there that are bursting on the seams, and we don't have any here, because despite our having a very huge labor force in our hands. So the argument for a weaker patent regime is not to give developing countries a free pass forever, just to allow them, just to have them imitate or produce lower quality things. It's basically just to allow them some space to catch up with the global tech frontier, and then the IPRs can be strengthened and standardized to global standards at that point. And these countries, the countries that have done that before, we can't argue against Germany where they are, and Korea and Japan. So they actually provide a good example that allowing that weak patent regime for a period or for the purpose of accelerating innovation, it isn't a descent to anarchy, really. It's actually a rather potent strategy. And the third argument is strong patent regimes tend to increase the cost of products. And I think globally, generally, most of the patents are usually in the pharmaceutical industries and biotech and stuff like that. So they tend to touch on the very issues that, say, a continent like Africa is struggling with. We still have food insecurity, we have massive public health issues. So any slight increase on the cost of essential products like that have far-reaching implications for millions of people. Obviously, there are downsides to a weak regime, which in the first place, there will be lack of incentive for foreign investors to come in because they're not sure, like, so my invention is just going to be copied rampantly. Will I even get my return on investment? And also, the sword cuts both ways. Even a local inventor is asking themselves, I'm also not very strongly protected. But so when you think about it, there is a pattern. There is a certain pattern of how things can work, and that is if IPRs can be strengthened alongside a growing domestic protection of local inventions by political regimes. So there has to be investment in this by the political regimes to say we need a balance, this balancing act between our local inventors and protecting what they're creating and foreign inventors, so that we don't just have that top-down, like west to south kind of receiving of tech. We need to also have a certain level of bottom-up, which is always something I like to hear. So at the present moment, how are we as a continent performing in terms of patents? So we are not performing very well. So the only countries that are performing well is really, there are only two. It's South Africa and Mauritius. South Africa is in the big league. So at the very top of the curve in terms of by quantity of patents is you have US, Europe, Japan, they're top of the curve. And then second in line you have Korea, Canada, Australia, and the BRICS. And South Africa is part of the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Then after that, you have smaller, wealthy nations like Bahamas, Bermuda, and now that's where Mauritius is playing at. So as a continent, the leader is South Africa. And South Africa has consistently registered around 1,000 domestic patents every year since 1980. And the data that I'm referring to goes up to 2010 from 1980. So they've consistently been registering around 1,000 domestic patents. And these accounts for about 15%. So out of 100% of the patents that South Africa registers every year, 70% are foreign oriented. So they come from US and Europe. And then you have 12% from other high income countries, at the top of them, Japan and Australia. And then the remaining 3% is what other African countries and other emerging economies contribute, that those other corporations that are trying to register patents in South Africa, only 3% from the rest of the continent and other emerging economies. First of all, it's not unusual that South Africa is registering far higher foreign patents than local. That's fairly common even with developed countries. And on South Africa's part, they have a very stable ratio of foreign to domestic patents. Where the concern is fellow African countries and other emerging markets. 3% is really low. And to put that into perspective, so this data I'm referring to is from World Intellectual Property Organization. So in total, like since where as far as the records go, 1980 to 2010, South Africa has registered over 34,000 patents with WIPO. The rest of the African countries combined have registered 2,488. That's what we're talking about. That is the level of disparity. So South Africa is performing very well. The rest of Africa, not too much. And the interesting part is that obviously South Africa is not even currently the largest African country. The largest economy right now is Nigeria. And if you combine Nigeria and Angola, which are high up on GDP, combined, Nigeria and Angola have about a third of the continent. But between them, Nigeria has only registered 73 patents with WIPO and Angola only 2. And this is somewhat interesting because generally there is a pattern of correlation between a country's GDP and their growth in patent protections, like the number of inventions they're having and trying to protect. So it's something very interesting. It points to quite some problem in terms of patent management because it looks like certain countries are highly, you have absolutely no incentive at all to go and have your invention there, because actually something else that was interesting to pick up was that even the few inventions coming from Nigeria, people prefer to register them in the US or Europe. So the low number of patents in the continent indicates a very heavy reliance on inventions from global multinationals, which is a top-down transfer of technology from the West, and obviously with the exception of South Africa. South Africa is performing very well. So the reality is that the same picture that we see in trade in goods, where Africa is largely an importing continent, is really also being reflected very strongly in intellectual property. So we are not doing very well, and I can only hope that with the AFTA in place, that somehow local invention is going to be stimulated, and also that their patent regimes are also going to, get a few more things going, especially south to south kind of exchange of transfer of technology.
That's really amazing. I don't know, Christine, is there something that you want to say?
Becky has said much of like what can be said on this topic, and I agree with her as far as like the protection goes. It's a balance. Like some protection is needed, but then taking into account the other aspect. But there are two things also that I would like to mention on from what Becky has said. The fact that African countries don't seem to be pursuing the IP and that kind of market as strongly from the statistics that she has indicated. And the potential loss that could come out of this is mainly for revenue, for instance, in terms even of tax revenue. Because you see, for the countries that now own these IP rights are the ones you're paying to. And now what has been happening, and this is a study, even the base erosion and profit shifting framework that the OECD has been trying to come up with, it's mainly trying to target these kinds of eroding the base of tax through things like intangible assets. And intangible assets take the form of IP. So now normally what happens is that the person who owns these platforms, the African countries are paying those countries, and the amounts that are paid to them are quite significant. And for the longest time, like even tracing that kind of payment and trying to ask, what are the functions that are performed? What are the risks that are assumed? Because intellectual property in its very nature may not have as much risk as maybe a physical asset that you need to insure and that kind of thing. So there has been such debate, like what are the functions that this person you're paying a lot of money to as an African country through the companies that are paying, what are the functions they are performing for you to pay them this? What are the risks that they're assuming, But that's because even in the very traditional sense, you want to see like what's the real risk? And with intangible assets, those risks now, like they look different. It's like the risk of losing it and that kind of thing. So there's the potential loss of tax revenue, which has been happening, which OECD through BEPS is trying to address. And therefore, it's not just the loss of like the investment itself and the potential for growth. There is actual loss of revenue right now. And then the other thing I would say is that the spillover of losses from loss of IP investments in Africa through the other sectors. So for instance, a lot of manufacturing that's happening in the world today, it's powered by the knowledge and the creative sectors. So, and a lot of IP, like the patents that Becky has spoken about. So without these kinds of innovations, what's happening is that our other sectors, production centers and such kinds of areas will not grow as fast, because what's happening is that there's that innovation that's supposed to make things easier, faster, and to produce products that are very competitive in the market, the world market right now. They require a lot of innovation and a lot of IP. So without investment in the IP and growth in that sector, it spills over to lack of growth in these other sectors. So whether it's the manufacturing, whether it's the extractive sector, whether it's in the service industries, then that's what happens. And so I think those are some thoughts that someone could have from what Becky is saying. What does that mean from the money side? And those are the thoughts that I have. There's the potential loss of tax revenue. It's not just potential, it's happening. And then there's the loss that will be felt in the other industries. Yeah, Chido, that's what I would like to add to that.
Okay, thank you so much, Christine. And I do agree with you guys, everything that you have said, and it's really a cause for concern that the continent is not really doing so well when it comes to the intellectual property market. And it seems as if we are unfazed as a continent when it comes to issues of innovation and all other things. Right? I can give you a very valid example. We have got the ARIPO, which is basically the African Regional Intellectual Property Organization. That is basically supposed to be for African countries because it's in the continent. But rarely do you see so much enthusiasm in other African countries in actually trying to be, a part of it and registering their patents and their, copyrights, trademarks, industrial designs within the office, which then really, makes one wonder. And just as how Becky said that there are a limited number of registered patents by African countries within the continent, it's very true. It actually doesn't only apply to patents. Even if you check trademarks statistics, even if you check on industrial designs, you realize the same pattern. When I'm really looking at intellectual property rights, especially within the context of Africa, my heart is so drawn to indigenous knowledge systems, or what in some words they would call traditional knowledge, which is pretty much an intellectual property right, but it's more or less like a bit autonomous from the regime that we're used to, right? And it's something that is very common and popular, especially within the African continent's context, but it's still not being given the attention that it so desires, right? For instance, if you go back to the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, you realize that currently there is not really an agreement that actually is very specific when it comes to the protection of indigenous knowledge systems. And it's only when you come to Africa, because like I said, it's a very important aspect of our lives in Africa, and it's actually one area of intellectual property that we should actually be getting revenue from. And you have an agreement that has been promulgated under the ARIPO. So maybe to just give somebody an idea of what I mean when I'm really talking about traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge system. So basically, this is any knowledge that originates from a local or traditional community, and that is as a result of intellectual activity. So examples could be folklore, indigenous knowledge systems in a digital era. We're talking about all this other like every information that is handed down from generation to generation. If you really try to be very practical, you realize that's our life of living, especially within the African context, right? And this traditional knowledge is very dominant in sectors like agriculture, medicine, and science. But we still have an instance where those rights are not adequately protected. And because they are not given the attention that they so desire, there are a lot of innovations that are actually just being wasted without getting the value out of it. I'll give you a very valid example, right? I remember, if you all guys remember, that when COVID started, there was a story about how Madagascar had sort of found a cure for COVID-19, which was pretty much based on a plant that they actually have there. Ordinarily, it's supposed to be protected under IP rights, but specifically with respect to indigenous knowledge systems, because it's pretty much knowledge that has been passed generations from generations. In Zimbabwe right now, we have a situation where there is a specific plant that they call Zumbani, that everybody is just going back into the bush to get. It's not a new invention, so to say, but it's a plant that has constantly been used to treat flus, to treat all these other ailments. So you find that already the person who actually decided to suggest that they use it for COVID-19 is not getting anything out of it. And if then this big pharmaceutical company is going to come to Zim and get the plant and actually realize that they can make a vaccine out of it, I don't think there is anything that's going to be benefited by the actual communities that, came up with that idea, you see now. So I feel like we need to start taking these matters seriously as a continent. We really need to start putting our foot down when it comes to intellectual property. And I'm really looking forward to how it's going to be part of the ACTA framework. I want to see how it's going to be played out. I'm hopeful that at least maybe when we now have this ACTA, it's going to address all this that we are raising today. I found this statement really intriguing. Somebody, she's a well-known researcher when it comes to intellectual property rights, Dr. Ezeanya. She actually said that, for Africa, we need to start acknowledging the significance of indigenous knowledge as a key to the component advancement. Because a lot of all the other innovations and ideas that can be patented and all these other things, they come from the same body of knowledge that we've always had generations to generations. So I think because we're not really giving it the recognition that it desires, it might also then end up sort of justifying why at the end of the day we rank the lowest when it comes to trade, when it comes to patents, when it comes to industrial designs and all those other things, because the ideas that we're coming up with, they are not really protected. I think it's really something for policymakers to really consider, especially when they are going to be looking at an IP regime in terms of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I feel like they really have to make it so contextual that it actually addresses all these issues that we're talking about, so that we end up having a vital and a booming IP market within the continent. Is there anybody who has got final thoughts so that we close today's session?
That actually reminded me of, I was once in a conference and someone made a presentation and talked about this coastal community somewhere in East Africa that had successfully rehabilitated a dying mangrove forest. And then after it was all done and thriving and it was making news, the foreign organization that was working there doing research as the rehabilitation was going on apparently wanted to patent that. So they had packaged the process through which the rehabilitation was done and they wanted to patent it, and it became a big issue because they have just packaged the knowledge, but when they came in there, they didn't have a single idea about how to go about rehabilitating. It's the indigenous people that, they had their lead people who are like repositories of information, the older generation, and they asked them how the forest was before it got destroyed. There was some material here and there. It wasn't consolidated. But really, all the information that was needed to rehabilitate that forest came from the indigenous people. So it just reminded me, and that just goes to reinforce your point that we have a lot of information. We have a lot of very important and valuable information that could even be a source of income, but we are not getting anything from it, just learning from that community. If that patent had gone through, that technology now, because it's been packaged as a technology, would have been used elsewhere in a money income generating manner, and nothing flows back to the community that actually did the work and owns that knowledge.
You are so right, Stacey. Thank you for giving that example. It actually speaks to exactly the problem that we're having as a continent. We end up having other people, taking credit for patented work that actually originates from our indigenous communities that are not getting any recognition at the end of the day. It's really relevant. Christine, what would be your parting thoughts for today?
I agree with what you guys said, your observations, which got me thinking, is it maybe that Africa is not doing so badly in IP in the sense of what is registered and what other countries are doing, but like the indigenous rights are not being protected? Because when you look at all these things, when someone swoops in like a vulture to just like take up what has been done for decades in these indigenous communities and going out and protecting it, could it go back to what Becky was saying? Maybe some protection, the question of protection needs to be looked at. But because we live in the world right now where we know what pharmaceuticals will do, why not protect these things for the indigenous communities? Because we know it, because we know how the world functions right now and what rankings Africa is getting for not being innovative. Why not protect these things, So I think there's gap for protection, but also striking a balance. And there's a gap within Africa that we need to own up what we have used for decades and own it up and make a market out of it and make it worth the while for all these generations that have used these things. Those are my thoughts on that, Chindo.
Thank you so much. Guys, this was really an interesting conversation. I'm really happy we got to talk about this. Maybe we might actually decide to do a part 2 on the IP market in Africa, just monitoring progress and seeing what's happening on the landscape. With that, I thank you guys, and this becomes the end of our podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. We value your feedback, comments, questions. We are constantly willing to hear from you what you think about the station. Thank you so much, and bye.